record now. Admit to all. There's going to be loads of people coming in as they drop in.
Right.
Because we're about a couple of hundred people registered, but it's always the case. It's always going to be a third of the people don't turn up. Right, okay. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, brothers and sisters. Welcome to another Islamic courses session. As you come in, I'm just going to get everyone in. We'll start in the next 30 seconds or so. Okay, it's just a reminder to everyone, this is the session book review discussion, Fakhr RAZI'S TAFSIR, Great Exegesis, Volume 1, the Fatiha. So we have our translator, Dr. Saeed, who's the founding director of the Center for Advanced Study of the Qur'an and its Interpretation at the Freiburg University, which is in Germany, and it's hosted by Sheikh Salman Nasser, who's at the Qur'an University, instructor for the Legacy Institute, legacy.institute. For security reasons, obviously leave your name on the Zoom thing. Please keep it on silent or on mute. It is being recorded. If you're not registered, just leave your email address on the chat, and there is a Q&A session as well. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Sheikh Salman. Thank you, Salman.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ba'd. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Pleased to be hosting Sheikh Sohaib, as he's going to be telling us about this work that he's done. It's translation of the Great Exegesis at Tafsir al-Kabir by Imam Fakhr al-Razi. This is volume 1, the Fatiha, and this is what has been translated in English. And so Sheikh Sohaib, you already heard the introduction. Basically, obviously his background is in tafsir. Most of you probably know him already from various programs that that he has done, various activities that he's involved in. One thing that we neglected to mention was that this particular work, which is this topic of our discussion today, in 2018, it won the Sheikh Hamad Award for translation for its excellence in as an Arabic Islamic work translated into English. And I think anyone who has read the translation can see that a great deal of love and care and diligence and work really went into the preparation of this translation. So, to begin, I'd like to ask Sheikh Sohaib, Sheikh Sohaib, how exactly did your love of tafsir and your interest in Imam Razi and his work in tafsir, how does it begin? Is there a particular sort of beginning? Is there a story to how you got involved in this particular project?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Assalamu alaikum. And thank you so much for hosting me with this and for your kind introduction. And yeah, that question has two parts and in a way two answers. The what is my love for tafsir, and then what is my love for the tafsir of Imam al-Razi. So if we start with the tafsir part, naturally, growing up as a Muslim, I've always had a passion for the Qur'an, but it became really the central thing for me as what really drew me into wanting to commit as a Muslim and wanting to keep learning and keep exploring. I came to realize the amount of depth that is in this book, the amount of impact that it can have on an individual's life, the benefit that it has for the entire humanity. And I felt like, okay, in the first place, it was just that's what I'm most interested in. So I wanted to learn the Arabic language. And when I wanted to learn the Arabic language, it was for the Qur'an. And I know that a lot of times people do express that's their reason. But, as you can end up seeing through the path that I took, it's very clear, and I can say about myself with confidence that that was really what was pushing me all along. So when I came to decide to go further in Islamic studies and to study abroad, I angled myself that way. So in around 2009 is when I enrolled at Al-Azhar University. So before that, having done some Arabic studies here and there. And then at Al-Azhar, I had chosen specifically to be in the faculty of al-Dīn, which is faculty of theology, often is described that way, because that's where you can select a specialism in Quranic studies. So otherwise, most Westerners choose to go to faculty of Sharia because they feel that the most important thing that they can contribute and what they're interested to contribute is in the field of fiqh and fatwa. So that's where you go for that. So I myself, I'm hopeless at fatwa, and I have no hope and no intention to go into it. And I'm very at ease with that. But what I wanted to do really was to focus on the tafsir of the Qur'an. And also then, ultimately to go in a direction where you'd use that to benefit people, right? So that's the point that we can discuss a bit more, I suppose, as we go through.
You actually bring up an interesting point. Most people who go overseas to study, or generally they go somewhere to study and then they pick a specialization. It's rare to see someone pick a specialization in tafsir. And I think part of it genuinely does come back to, when you come back to your community, people are asking you questions.
Sure.
A lot of times the questions they're asking you, maybe they're fiqh questions. There might be other types of questions, but I don't think many people are going to ask you, what's the Arab of Qul Huwallahu Ahad? And
right.
Is this Dhamir? Is it really Dhamir al-Sha'an? Or, why have all the translators chosen this particular translation?
But to a particular extent, to some extent, at least, people are certainly asking about the Qur'an. They're asking about meanings of the Qur'an. But yeah, it's true that there's much less of that. But that in itself is something I feel needs to change. We actually need to show people why they should be engaging more directly with the Qur'an, and then questions should come up, and then you should be knocking on our doors with those questions. But what has sort of happened on a wider scale, and this is a tricky point, I suppose, is that much of scholarship has sort of discouraged people from reading the Qur'an directly, or even reading works of tafsir, and so they're relying on a diet of fiqh and fatwa, and then unfortunately sometimes even things that are less healthy than that. Fiqh and fatwa is great, but it becomes about debates and disputes and argumentation and stuff like that instead. So anyway, I was clear on what I'm interested in. So yes, we did study other things, and that's important when I'm talking about the journey with Tafsir al-Razi. I had to have some, acculturation into fiqh and usul al-fiqh and hadith and the usul of hadith and aqidah and also al-falsafa, because we have these branches within usul al-Dīn which we study to varying extents, and then you choose your specialization, and I chose a specialization in tafsir. Graduated from Al-Azhar in 2013. When I came back, I started my PhD in the field of or concerning the field of tafsir, I would say, because it's in SOAS, University of London. They don't have a faculty of tafsir or a track in tafsir, but they do study Quranic studies, of course. So my research was around the principle of tafsir al-Qur'an bil-Qur'an. And this is actually a funny thing that a lot of people assumed, because when I completed my PhD, I also, like that same year, the Great Exegesis Volume 1 came out. So a lot of people did assume that I did my PhD work on Imam al-Razi, which is not the case. In actual fact, Imam al-Razi plays a very small part in my thesis, which is maybe unfair, but even my Professor Muhammad Abdul Halim, of course, is well known. His translation of the Quran is very known. He did suggest to me that since you're looking at tafsir of the Quran through the Quran, Imam al-Razi is very big in that. But when I looked at the question, I didn't really feel he was particularly big in that. So I didn't give him a lot of space and attention in that regard. So the tafsir of al-Razi, it's interesting because this translation project was not my own creation. It wasn't my own idea. It was something that has an external agenda, which I then got involved in, and that is, as you can see on the cover. So I've got the thick edition here. It's the same one, but it's just sort of thicker pages. It says here the Royal Al-Bayt Institute for Islamic Thought. So that's the Jordanian institute, which is is headed by Prince Ghazi bin Muhammad. who is also well known for various projects, things like the Common Word Project and so on. But importantly, among the things that he's been responsible for creating and supporting is things like the website al-Tafsir.com, which was, in the early days of online tafsir, was the place you'd go to find digitized, tafsir texts. And actually, even till now, has a broader range than generally other sites that you would consult, because they set out with this, the person who donated the money for that project very specifically said, I want all texts that you can have, I want them to be there, and I want them to be untampered with. So that was the conditions that he made, which the team abided by.
It's also worth pointing out, very relevant to our discussion here, that they do actually have a couple of translations as well, English translations.
Right. So they have some things on the site, and as a part of the broader project, they have something called the Great Tafsirs project,
right,
or the Great Quran Commentaries project, and Tafsir of al-Razi fits into that. So the earlier works that they did, so various translators worked on things like the Tafsir, which is attributed to Ibn Abbas, although not authentically, but that's been translated in Tanwir al-Miqbas. Then there is, the Asbab al-Nuzul al-Wahidi.
Right, Asbab al-Nuzul al-Wahidi, the Tafsir al-Tustari.
Yes, that's right, and the Jalalain, because one of there's more than one translation of Jalalain in the market, but one of them is the one done under this project. And so, as well as Tustari, there are several other sort of Sufi or mystical commentaries that were done. And I suppose Tafsir of al-Razi is the first. With the Tafsir of al-Tabari, of course, I should mention, is another one that was published in part, and also by Islamic Text Society, same as al-Razi. So al-Razi was one of the first sort of very major substantial tafsirs that has been commissioned, but they commissioned volume 1. Now, how did I get involved? It's actually because at a certain point, I just felt like, okay, translation is something I can do. I feel like I'm good at it. I want to earn some money. Let's be honest, that's part of the motivation of doing things as well sometimes. Right. So I made contact with various institutions that seemed to be doing good things in translation. One of them was the Al-Bayt Institute, just through some contacts I found online, and through one thing led to another, and I was commissioned to translate the first volume of Tafsir al-Razi, which, to be honest, is a huge thing to ask someone to do. I'm thinking about what Zayd ibn Thabit said. If they had asked me to move a mountain from there to here, it would have been easier. I mean, to be honest, to trust someone to do it is a big thing, because frankly, and this is my assessment as well, there are lots of things that get translated that don't get translated well. So that sense of burden, and I like that you used the words love and care in what you said with regards to my work in translation. I hope that that's true. But the first feeling really is a sense of responsibility, because now you're handling a work of great importance to our tradition, but more importantly than that, one that connects with the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And somebody actually once put this to me, an Egyptian professor put it to me, that, don't you feel too much pressure that you're talking about the intent of God, Muradullah? And I said, no, I'm talking about Murad al-Razi, or Fahm al-Razi min Muradillah. So what did al-Razi understand God to be meaning in these ayat? But even that is a huge responsibility and burden. So to be honest with you, and I maybe haven't said this out loud or in public before taking on this project, Imam al-Razi was not that much in my repertoire of things that I would read often, engage with. And that's one of the reasons I took it on. I said, okay, Imam al-Razi's work is undoubtedly a central one in our tradition. It's a very rich one. I'm going to gain from this process. And that has been a guiding principle really in a lot of things that I've said yes to over time. Before that, by the way, I had already translated 1/4 of Al-Itqan fi Ulum al-Qur'an for a separate project based out of Qatar. But that project, in a way, because it was very much based around the linguistics of the Qur'an, I had really had to get to grips with how that works. And on that project, I had a professor who was overseeing and checking my work and giving me detailed feedback. That's Professor Alexander Knish, who's Russian and based in the US. So that process had given me a certain amount of confidence that, yes, I mean, I've learned from the mistakes that I did make inevitably, and you know what, I could do this. And I felt like, okay, this work is going to need everything that I have gained from my journey in Al-Azhar. I'm going to need to bring it to bear here. And wallahi, I felt that really on every page, just, you know, because you're dealing with the linguistic content, you're dealing with the tafsir terminologies and how that works, and the qira'at, and you're dealing with philosophical content and kalam-based content, and you're dealing with fiqh, and you're dealing with usul al-fiqh. And you're dealing with some tasawwuf as well, because Imam al-Razi was not necessarily very big in tasawwuf, but there's some content there which is also of spiritual nature and referring to figures. And you know, even I've seen people made mistakes. There's a big index done in French of al-Razi's Tafsir, and the author of that has written in the index Dhunnun, and he thought that Razi was referring to Prophet Yunus, whereas of course the Dhunnun al-Masri,
exactly,
the famous Sufi figure. So the point is, you have to actually be, I mean, that author is, I'm sure, very familiar, but he just slipped up here. But if I had just entered into this without having a certain amount of background and training, you know, I'll misread everything. And that's really, I think, a problem that people do when they start translating texts that they're not ready to translate. And one of the guiding principles, I think, the one that I follow is, you know, would I be able to teach this book confidently without looking stupid? Could I talk about this book in front of someone who's more learned without looking stupid and without slipping up and without thinking that what's a simple word, like you might use a word like dawr, 3 letters, dal, waw, ra. Dawr is like your turn, spinning, right? It could be the floor of a building, apartment building,
right?
Or it's infinite regress, right? So you have to have a certain familiarity with how these words are showing up in the discussions that they're referencing. So yeah, so the background is really that I wanted to further my own engagement with tafsir and the complexity of a work like Tafsir al-Razi, and I decided to take it on. And you know, very early on, of course, met a lot of challenges, which over time, I think, inshallah, I managed to overcome. Because ultimately, you know, you have to think about one day, this is going to be out there. People will look at it. People will assess what you did. So, you know, all of you readers out there were living in my head rent free. And I was thinking about professors who would read it. And I was thinking about ordinary Muslims who would read it. And all of these things had an effect on, you know, how I chose to go about it. Because again, like you say, love and care, or let's say also the sense of responsibility and burden is, I don't want a single person to be misled or confused by something that's my fault, right? So people might have their opinions about the tafsir of Imam al-Razi, which we can maybe talk about, but I don't want it to be my fault, right, that just I misconstrued something.
Misunderstood something.
Or I put something across without maybe drawing attention to the point in the footnote to clarify something, just to make it easier for the reader to contextualize and make sense of what they're reading.
By the way, this brings up an interesting sort of dilemma with translation of these sorts of scholarly works. You know, obviously, and I'm sure you're well aware of this, and probably dealing with the editions of Tafsir al-Kabir of al-Imam al-Razi. You've probably seen this, that you know the knowledge level of the muhakkik can have an important impact on the way that he presents the text, the way that he understands the text, the way that he reads the text. But when you're a muhakkik, you still don't necessarily have to understand each and every word. You just have to reproduce it as is. When you're a translator, you don't actually have that luxury, do you? You have to have actually understood everything.
Okay, sorry, technical issue there. So Yeah, that's completely right. So a translator's burden is distinct in that way, or worse in that way. Let's say that I have to first be a reader. I have to be a strong reader of the text before
Yes.
anything else. So I have to confidently know that I'm reading this correctly, and that won't come necessarily on the first attempt, right? So I could be very cocky with you and say, oh yes, I read Tafsir al-Razi like the cover to cover and it was completely easy. It was not easy. It is not easy. In fact, maybe I'm pointing to the opposite problem, is that if you find it too easy, maybe it's because you're underestimating what you're reading, right? So
Yes.
there would be times that that I could be puzzling over a sentence for days, puzzling over a word for hours, or I have to bookmark something and come back to it later. And there are a few points, and I hope that this would be in my credit with the reader. There are maybe about 3 places in this book where I've said, look, I couldn't really make sense of what exactly he meant here. This is the word that he mentioned, the rough here. He said there's something about a rough. I've looked up the word rough. I've looked for some, this is what I think it could be referring to, but I'm not sure. Now, in another world, I could be that translator who just basically papers over these things, to not disturb the reader. I want the reader to know if I struggled with something, because then ultimately someone can look it up and figure it out, and just, then we can fix it in another edition, or you can refute me in another publication. That's fine, if that's about advancing knowledge. So the first task, as I say, is to be a strong reader. And then, so a lot of my approach in translation is thinking about myself as a teacher. So as if I am teaching this, what do I need the person to know and to understand? And if I come across something, and that's the issue, of course, we're working with classical texts. Because in the field of tafsir, in the field of tafsir publication, a lot of what is being produced is translations. There's not that many translations of classical texts, but there are an increasing number. And I'm talking about English here. So the picture is different in some other Islamic languages like Turkish or Persian, or I'm sure Urdu, and there are things that are being produced in Indonesian language and so on. But in terms of English, we only have a few classical works. But there is still obviously a preference for translating works of tafsir rather than writing original ones, because who's going to have the guts really to write original works of tafsir? Of course, there are a few like that. But translating classical works, of course, you're bringing things, from some centuries ago into the current time. So if those are theological questions, for example, how relevant is that to a reader who is just wanting to understand what the Qur'an is saying? Do they want to know how the Mu'tazila understood this in contrast with how the Ash'ari understood it, and the debate that took place between the two sides? Yeah, some readers would be, sure, but probably a large majority don't find that particularly useful. So you also have statements which are sort of their time, right? So I didn't come across much of this with Imam al-Razi, to be honest, but at least in volume 1, there's one anecdote which I felt was told in a way which is a little bit misogynistic. And I felt like just translating it as it is would cause a certain disturbance in the reader. And if I don't comment on it, it's almost like I'm sort of saying, well, that's perfectly fine. And I don't think it is perfectly fine, albeit Imam al-Razi is just telling a story, but it's got a certain tinge to it, which I personally didn't like. And ultimately it was implying it was a man who was trying to do some good deeds, and then he said he overcame the shayateen, that he overcame the devils, but their mother overcame me, meaning his wife, right? She prevented him from doing a good deed. It's very simply, I just said in the footnote, well, there are some male devils who prevent women from doing good deeds as well. I mean, it doesn't really have to be said. It's an obvious point, but it's the kind of thing you probably wouldn't write in a work at the current time. But it comes up, and that's part of the academic honesty that I think is necessary in this, not to excise things from our tradition entirely, not to hide them, not to distort what the author wanted to actually say. But that's one of the key issues as well, because you mentioned another aspect, which is the muhaqqiq, or the critical editor of the works. You know, a lot of the works, of course, that are published. Let's see, Imam al-Razi is, of course, an Ash'ari scholar, theologian. His position on Aqidah matters is an Ash'ari one. It's distinct in its own ways as well. But, you know, he's, for example, very much at home with doing a figurative interpretation of certain attributes of God as they are described, you know, as taken from the Qur'an, the Sunnah text, or the Qur'an and Sunnah. So he would say that, well, it's not to be taken at face value or in its literal sense, but it's to be understood in another sense, right? So this is a well-known issue of the Kalam schools, right? So, you know, I'm not going to be saying in the footnote, and this is against the madhab of the Salaf, and you know, or sort of hide these things, or, you know, we need to present things as they are, and
Right.
and that's even assuming that, you know, that some people have a problem with these positions. You know, we need to be able to appreciate the points and the arguments made by the author. And I think that you know, the Tafsir of al-Razi being translated is something that can provide, you know, another voice really in what's available in English in the Tafsir tradition.
I mean, that brings up an interesting question, which is that, you know, that obviously for the English reader, you know, he doesn't have direct access to the tradition. Although if he was an Arabic reader, I mean, you know, sometimes there's this notion, and sometimes in scholarly circles, of sort of acting as a sort of gatekeeper, that, you know, in terms of what do we want the masses to read and not read, or hear, which message we want them to hear and not hear. But the reality is that, you know, if you're an Arabic speaker, you have access to all those things. Especially now, it's very easy to access them. And so it raises an interesting issue in terms of, you know, there's only so much of the Turath, particularly when it comes to tafsir, the tafsir tradition. There's not a whole lot that is available in English. So you have maybe, you know, a volume of Tafsir al-Qurtubi, you have sections of al-Tabari, you have a summarized version of Tafsir ibn Kathir, not even, you know, the original Tafsir ibn Kathir. And then some shorter works, like we mentioned, Jalalain and Tustari. But, you know, with al-Razi, al-Razi is interesting because he is, as you sort of alluded, he's a unique voice. He's also an important and influential voice. And he's also an important voice, because, and I'm sure, you know, with your familiarity and your expertise now in al-Razi, that you know better than I do, how influential he is on later scholars. You know, his work is one that is actually very important. And so that makes it very important that, you know, people have an idea of, this is what actual, you know, if you want to understand the history of the Islamic scholarship, regardless of whether you agree or disagree with Imam al-Razi's approach or certain of his opinions, this is a pivotal contribution to the history of that scholarship.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so Imam al-Razi himself fits into the tradition. He, you know, there are some discourses about how he sought to revolutionize tafsir, and you know, I think that could be overstated. He definitely was following in tradition. He was building on works before. He draws a lot from Tafsir of al-Zamakhshari. He draws a lot from the Tafsir of al-Wahidi, and uses a wide range of sources besides them. So he is drawing from a kind of, you know, what is typically thought of as the Ma'thur, which is to say opinions that have already been expressed and things which are attributed not only to the Prophet ﷺ, but also to the companions and the Tabi'een. And he's drawing from those materials and the existing opinions, and he's attributing things to their sources in his own way, not with full isnad like Imam al-Tabari, but in a more abbreviated style. And he's discussing a wide range of things around how we are going to explore the Qur'an. What's interesting about Volume 1 is that it's called Volume 1 the Fatiha, and it is the Fatiha, but it has got a lot of very extensive introductory material, right? Later on in the tafsir, you'll find things that we'll call them tangents, right? As in he's following a certain track, verse by verse, and then he'll go off a little bit on a tangent, and some people will delight in that, and others will say things like "Fihi kullu shay'in illa tafsir." There's everything in there except tafsir. Remember that famous jibe? I think is Abu Hayyan who probably initiated this, and
I think it was Ibn Taymiyyah. Ibn Taymiyyah said في كل شيء إلا التفسير, and then I think it's a Subki, either Subki the father or Ibn Subki the son, who responded saying في كل شيء مع التفسير.
Right, so it contains everything except tafsir. That was the jibe, and then, oh no, it contains everything alongside tafsir. Of course, I'm more with the second, I'm more with the Subki camp on this, but there is, of course, a difference between.
I think deep down Ibn Taymiyyah probably was as well, but he had to say it.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you look at Ibn Taymiyyah's own work of tafsir, you know, it's not that different from Imam al-Razi's anyway, and he's certainly very reflective and philosophical himself. But you know, one is sometimes can find these dismissive expressions out of their place. But you know, I'll tell you what, my work on volume 1, there was a time when I was more in camp, everything except tafsir, because you know, there really is a lot of material in this, and that's a bit of advice I'm giving to you if you've got this and if you're reading it. Just understand and be okay with the fact that you know, there are 3 kitabs in here: book 1, book 2, book 3. Book 1 is called, you know, it's the tafsir of the isti'adha, you know, a'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. It's based around that, but to a large extent, this is really a linguistic introduction to his whole project. So see it in that respect, and if you're really into linguistics and the philosophy of language, then this is your, you know, favorite bit. Then you've got the second book. This is around Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, and it is, but to a large extent, really, it's an exploration of certain theological questions, the names of Allah, attributes of Allah. So if you're really into ilm al-kalam, this is your, you know, this is the bit you're going to be excited by. And then you get to the third kitab. That's when you have something which is more recognizable as this is a tafsir of Surah al-Fatiha. And he actually talks about it that way himself. He acknowledges that. He's like, and now we'll get on with the tafsir, right? So at that point, then, even then, there's a few chapters which are kind of introductory. They talk about some names of the surah. And then there's a big fiqhi discussion around, you know, is the basmala to be, is it part of the surah or not? Is it recited in prayer audibly or not? Or do people recite behind the imam or not? And that's where Imam al-Razi is, you know, defending the Shafi'i positions. And in the footnote, I give a little bit of pushback from the Hanafi side. That's just so to complete the picture. Sorry, Hanbalis and Malikis. But then you get to what I would call the Tafsir Proper. And that's where he's actually going through in book 5 in chapter 5 of book 3. He then goes into a sort of verse by verse, the benefits under each ayah. So the linguistic but it's a lot of it is really reflections around the surah, because then he follows that up with overall sort of structural observations about the surah and the names of Allah in the surah and the connection between the surah and the salah and the mi'raj, you know, very interesting things, spiritual observations. So there's a lot there. It does help if you've read some of the earlier material to kind of get a grasp for his language and get an introduction to how he talks. But otherwise, you know, you're justified to just open up a book 3, almost chapter 5, and that's where you'll find the Tafsir Proper. So in this book, there's a lot of things besides Tafsir. You know, that's fine. But what it definitely does and adds to the library of Quranic studies and Tafsir is to say there is so much that can be explored about the Quran. And that's really the key thing that you can get from this. It is not merely let's narrate what did the Salaf say about each ayah, and that's what Tafsir is. Right? This can kind of open your mind to what are the kind of things that can be thought about. And okay, sometimes he goes and talks about some spiritual philosophical things, you know, in the Tafsir of Surah Yusuf, for example, what are dreams and how is knowledge conveyed through dreams. He's giving some thoughts and ideas about that based on the knowledge of his time. Sometimes he'll talk about scientific aspects, again, based on the knowledge of his time. And a lot of that, you can really see how appropriate it is and how relevant it is and how useful it is. And maybe in modern times, we can appreciate that more than some people were doing in the kind of middle ages, as it were, where they didn't appreciate it. But now it's like, we have so many questions, and it's helpful that somebody before has actually looked at those questions with the kind of expert eye in all the, the ulum of Islam, that you would hardly find someone nowadays who specializes to the level of someone like Imam al-Razi.
It's interesting you mentioned that. This brings up an interesting point about the Tafsir of al-Razi, that it sort of is a unique work in the way that it takes the Qur'an and also the Tafsir tradition and sort of situates it in sort of the larger context of the entire scholastic tradition of the Muslim world. And I say the entire scholastic tradition of the Muslim world rather than just the Islamic scholastic tradition, because you even have the falasifa and al-ulum al-tabi'iyya and things like that. That not everyone in the Islamic world who was taking part in those was necessarily a Muslim, because you also had Christian philosophers and Jewish philosophers, but of the Muslim world, and all of that was part of the larger scholastic tradition, of which al-Razi is very much a part of. And then the Tafsir tradition, it sort of is the historical background in which our Tafsir tradition developed. So it's unique also in that sense, in that it sort of gives the reader a window into appreciating all of this background that
I mean, that's true. And then sort of to balance or the other side of the story of what we were saying before, how al-Razi drew from those before him, he also influenced those after him, as you mentioned earlier. So we can find that if we look at, and there's much more research being done around this now, and people sort of trying to set the record straight, because there's certain images come into people's mind due to modern times and modern projects to uplift certain tafsirs, like the Tafsir of Ibn Kathir. Not to say anything against the Tafsir of Ibn Kathir, but the question of its centrality, in tradition, people have maybe nowadays kind of imagined that it's one of the most important tafsirs in our history, but it hasn't been important in our history.
It hasn't historically, it hasn't had that.
And people haven't been, a way of illustrating it is that it hasn't been part of the curriculum of the seminaries of the Islamic world, where they were heavily teaching works like the Tafsir of al-Baydawi, Tafsir of al-Zamakhshari, and the Tafsir of al-Razi, and the various commentaries on these works. And al-Razi, in a way, he's in between Zamakhshari and al-Baydawi. Al-Baydawi's text, which became for a long period of time the most important seminary text. You also had al-Jalalain, and you have others that are taught to students of tafsir, but he bases his work on al-Razi alongside Zamakhshari and Raghib al-Asfahani, as is commonly pointed out. So al-Razi has had an influence, on subsequent works. There are numerous works that make reference to him, and then all the way into the 19th century, something which I consider one of the masterworks of our tafsir library, Tafsir of al-Alusi. He is clearly sitting there with al-Razi right between his eyes, and he's following a lot of the thought process of al-Razi while drawing from all sorts of other works, and especially the super commentary tradition in tafsir, the Hashia tradition. There's a lot going on, but al-Razi's thought process in framing things as he did has had a lasting effect on tafsir as it has been formulated in later times. So again, having direct access to reading how he wrote what he's written is very valuable. And I've tried to make the translation accessible and readable. I have to say that in volume 1, that might not come through. Right? So I'm not unadvertising the work. Sure, buy it, inshallah, benefit from it. But I would say that in volume 1, I might have lent more heavily towards getting things as technically accurate as possible, and therefore couching things sometimes in language which is more the language of academics and scholars, because that's who I thought will most benefit from some of these extensive linguistic discussions and philosophical, theological discussions. But the next volume that I'm working on is a compilation volume. Again, this is chosen and commissioned by the Ahl al-Bayt Institute and by Prince Ghazi. Maybe it's his personal choice of which surahs, I'm not 100% sure. But the surahs which are in that volume, which is still, I'll tell you more about it in a minute, I think, inshallah, but it's still underway. The surahs are Surah Yusuf, Surah Al-Kahf, Surah Al-Naml, and Surah Al-Mulk, and maybe Surah Yasin, because on a bit of ongoing discussion around that. But the thing is that in volume 2, I've really tried to tame the temptation to be technical and academic and just try to make it more readable, because when it comes to volume 2, because it is actually surahs of the Quran, it's more likely that individuals would pick it up in order to really just appreciate the words of Allah and connect to the words of Allah through the words of the Imam. So I want to really make sure that they'll be able to read it as easily as possible. So yeah, that's okay. I can maybe tell you a bit about volume 2 and how it's kind of a bit of a change from what I've done previously in volume 1.
Yeah, that's actually a good point. If you could tell us more about volume 2, but also, you know, in coming back to something that we sort of discussed at the beginning, which was this issue of connecting people to the Quran. You know, as you said at the very beginning, that not many people go into tafsir, most of them they go into fiqh, and you don't get, you know, maybe people don't ask as much questions about them. So, you know, obviously now if we're going to be translating tafsirs into English, or even perhaps writing original tafsir work in English, it does raise the question of sort of, you know, how do we connect the average Muslim, who is an English speaker, obviously, to the Quran using these works? And in particular, sort of, where do you see sort of this project with the Tafsir al-Razi? Where does it fit in with that as sort of as a larger end goal?
Yeah, that's a tricky question and a big one, and one that I'm sure that you and I will continue to think about beyond this conversation. But I certainly don't think that tafsir is the be-all and end-all. Don't tell anyone when I said that, because my tag on Twitter and so on is Tafsir Doctor. I'm very big on tafsir. You know, I love tafsir, but I have to recognize the boundaries and limits of writing technical works on the Quran, compared to the bigger goal and the bigger responsibility, which is to help people find the guidance of the Quran and to walk in its light. Tafsir is about explaining its meanings. First and foremost, that's really what it's all about. Clarifying the meanings of the Quran is definitely something that is part of that process. You know, people need to know what is the message of the Quran. So they have to have the opportunity to read and to hear the Quran and to encounter it wherever they are. So, you know, the big question is, are people reading books anymore? You know, I think I suppose this is for any book, but if you type it on Google, the first thing will come up is people looking for the PDF. The thing is, if people are looking for the PDF because they want to read the PDF, then alhamdulillah. But the important thing is to read it however you read it. But the patience to read through books, I think, is becoming a little bit, you know, it's becoming rarer, isn't it? So that's a challenge that we face in the publishing industry generally. How do we get people interested in reading? So do we have to make things simpler for people? Do we have to change up the format? Do we take people through a process where, you know, Tafsir al-Razi is not like probably the first thing you'd pick up and read in Tafsir, and I'm not suggesting that it is. I think that we need to also fill some gaps with things that can get people to a level where they'd appreciate the Tafsir of al-Razi. And that's not to say that there aren't things, you know, good things already there, but I feel that there is still a lot of work to do. And books are just part of that story. You know, all technologies have to be brought to bear, you know. And then
so I think what you're saying then is that, you know, we need to sort of see if maybe we can synthesize Tafsir al-Razi into a series of short video clips for Snapchat.
It's TikTok now, Sulaiman. It's not
TikTok. I'm sorry.
You got to do the moves. I don't know even know what that would look like. No, I'm not on that platform, just to clarify. So we need to certainly make things more accessible, but it's not about obviously making Tafsir al-Razi more accessible, but we if this is more suitable for certain types of people and levels of people, then let's cater for those people. That's something I do believe. Not everything has to be directly targeted to the quote unquote masses. That's
Right.
fine. But I want actually Muslim scholars and and would-be scholars and trainee scholars to take the field of tafsir more seriously, to understand what they can get out of it, but also to recognize that just specializing in knowing what the mufassirin are saying and debating is not the purpose. It's just a means towards getting to the point where you can actually deliver a message to people in whatever format you're comfortable. Not everybody is a public speaker or inspirational TikToker or whatever, but whatever means that you have to deliver a message that is meaningful to people and helps them to benefit from the guidance of the Qur'an as intended by Almighty God when sending it down, and then as understood by the Mufassirin, whose task it was to help clarify the intent of God in his speech. Then we need all hands on deck, and we need more people to specialize in tafsir as well, as we were pointing to before.
So I mean, I think if in that case, if we need more people to be specializing in tafsir and engaging in tafsir at higher levels, then obviously, having these sorts of resources available is a very important step in that direction, because you can like in your own case, as you mentioned, you had to go through a process. You learned Arabic, you studied the language, you studied the Quran, then you started various steps in your formal studies, eventually enrolling in al-Azhar and basically and beyond. For me personally, I can also say that in my personal journey, there were things that I read in English before I read anything in Arabic that also were a very important part of my studies, for getting to the point where I started in learning Arabic, and then after learning Arabic, studying works in the Arabic language. But there's a lot of resources that are available today that maybe 20 years ago they weren't available. They could have helped people like you and me in that situation, and other people who are in that situation now. I mean, I think it actually is important to have those sorts of resources.
I think it's important to emphasize this point, because I don't want people, طلاب العلم, as you always say, the students of knowledge. I don't, and we're among them, right? We should not sniff at the value of translations, and I mean, inshallah, good translations that have attention to detail and attention to quality. Don't sniff at the value of studying these works alongside the Arabic originals, because there is this thing that goes around where people say, well, what's the point of translating Tafsir al-Razi? Anyone who is of the level to study it should study it in Arabic, and anyone who doesn't know Arabic is not at the level to even look at Tafsir al-Razi. They should not even bother. Why would you read such a thing in English? And to be honest, I probably had some sympathy with that view, especially when I started and realized how hard it was. I was saying to myself, who would read this, especially at the beginning, when it was this really deep philosophical stuff about the origins of language and stuff like that. But I definitely came to realize that, look, as part of a curriculum, to learn how the language of tafsir works, and to become yourself able to then go and translate, because that's part of what we're doing at CASQI, and you're a big help in this, the Center for Advanced Study of the Quran and its Interpretation. We are actually training people to read tafsir well and to translate tafsir as well. So the work that we're currently doing is on the tafsir of Ibn Juzay. Tafsir Ibn Juzay has a full draft translation that was already done, and then it arrived with me to have a look and edit it and improve it. And I decided to run this as an open process, where I have people on Zoom who have some requisite background, not complete beginners. They've got Arabic language, among other things. And we read through together, and we read the draft translation together, and I give critical remarks on the translation while correcting it, so people can see how things, not just how things are done right, but how things are done wrong. I think is an important part of the learning process. So my hope is that even if a few of those people come out of this process and go into translation, I'll be living rent-free in their head, inshallah. They'll have the fear of God in them, and they will have that sense of responsibility towards the work that they do, the sense of burden, of precision, and making sure to get things right, because it will not do to simply write down anything and then walk away from the text and put that out into the public to consume things that are mistranslated, as this is happening a lot. I'm very sorry to say it's happening a lot,
unfortunately, it's
on the wider scene. I would probably like to just shed light on the work on volume 2, because there's a crucial aspect of Tafsir al-Razi which we didn't talk about, which is the lack of critical edition. So one of the fundamental challenges that I had with this text, and continue to have, is the fact that there has not been produced a tahqiq or critical edition of this text. All the copies that are out there, including the digital versions online, are just copy-paste of the same edition, which has a number of mistakes, right from the early days of Bulaq, where a certain, appreciable job was done, but there were still errors, whole sentences that are missed out or distorted, words that are distorted. So there's a lot of work to be done on producing a proper edition in Arabic of this text. And I'm quite bitter about this, because here I am trying to translate into English and having to still struggle to figure out what actually is what's it supposed to say in the Arabic, never mind what does it mean. So I had to find some solutions to that for volume 1, which, alhamdulillah, I really feel that I managed to overcome the problems at that point, even though I didn't have access to a full manuscript of even the Fatiha at that time. Since then, I became more connected to what's going on in the manuscript world. And actually, a lot more has started to happen. Things are being shared. Turkey has become a major exporter of digitized manuscripts. And I have now dozens and dozens of even complete manuscripts of Tafsir al-Razi from different countries and sources, different centuries. And so, even though I've actually already done the translation work of for volume 2, which is the compilation of surahs, I'm now going through it again and comparing with manuscripts and checking on certain words, which I'd flagged up in my own footnotes as needing further attention. So a lot of things are being cleared up. So really, in a way, the translation will be the most accurate representation, more than the Arabic printed editions for the time being. But I also, inshallah, step by step, I'm looking to actually produce that Arabic edition. Again, I really wish someone else had taken it on. And if someone wants to take the burden from me, I will gladly support you 100%. But until then, I'm making some moves now to at least to start with volume 1, to produce the Arabic critical edition based on the manuscripts. Perhaps release that in the first place and see how it goes, and then perhaps inshallah become a full project with a team, because it really does need a team. It's obviously an enormous task to take on. But when it comes to the translation, a lot of people ask me as well whether, and we're just going to stop for Q&A in just a second. People ask me the question you might be about to ask: are we planning to translate the whole of Tafsir al-Razi? Well, the Prince Ghazi himself has asked me this. He said, if we got the funding, would you be willing to take it on? And I said, look, CD, we've got here, this one took me 2 years, 1 volume out of 32 volumes, Tafsir al-Razi. So 1 volume took 2 years. Let's suppose that I speed up and I manage to do 1 volume a year. That's still another 30 years. I'm going to grow quite old. I would die doing it. And you know what he said? He said, it's a good way to die. So to be honest, my own position on this is, I feel like maybe after the volume 2, I'd feel like I've done what needed to be done from my side in terms of translating Tafsir al-Razi, not to stop anyone else, as long as they do it in quality, because I will come after you if you do a bad quality translation. But I want to work on some other things. I want to work on some more contemporary tafsirs. You and I are already in talks about developing a project on the tafsir of Ibn Ashur. So this is where I think I would rather be directing some efforts rather than necessarily staying in the the 6th or 12th century.
Right. So that brings up a very important point about sort of there's this dilemma between balancing translating classical works and making the tradition accessible to readers, and also the need to produce new, fresh works that speak to the modern reader, speak to the English-speaking reader, that that he can relate to, and that also can answer, because you spoke about Imam al-Razi. Imam al-Razi is very interesting in his tafsir because he has all sorts of questions that he's trying to answer, but a lot of times those questions that he's trying to answer are coming from the environment that produced his work. And so obviously now we live in a sort of a different environment. We have different questions. Sometimes some of the questions, quite frankly, are they might be actually silly, objectively looking at them. 100 years from now, people might look back and say, were people really debating the number of genders? But but nonetheless, for people today, those questions might be the question that needs answered more than some of the philosophical ideas that perhaps Imam al-Razi was debating at that time. So there's definitely a need for original new works in tafsir that speak to the reader.
I mean, in that respect, I mean, so obviously not everybody believes in me to this extent, but there are people who say, Sohaib, when are you going to write your own tafsir or whatever? Maybe people who are maybe have an inflated view of me, but the point is, I would generally say to such people, I'm in no hurry to do that. I really believe in the idea of doing your time and really building yourself before trying to do something very overambitious and rash, almost really to put yourself in that position. So yeah, I really believe in doing what we call khidmah, or service to the great minds of our past and even of our recent past. Work on those texts. There's still a lot to be done in presenting the works of the ulama properly. So I'm content with working on that for as long as possible, until something inside me boils over and I feel the need to write original works in tafsir. But if I ever get round to doing that, I would have been benefited a lot from the fact of having worked on Tafsir al-Razi and other works of tafsir, in order to understand really how the ulama went about doing what they do, so I can actually see where I might fit in as a person in the modern, postmodern era.
And that brings us back to an interesting point that you made about al-Razi himself. And I'll just mention this before I go on to the questions, because I think there's a lot of questions now, and they're probably getting tired of listening to me. Imam al-Razi himself, if you look at what he was doing in his tafsir, largely that's what he was doing. As you mentioned, the tafsir of al-Wahidi, the tafsir of al-Zamakhshari, and other works were in front of him as he was writing, drawing on them, and he was building on these sources. And then he, in turn, the scholars who came after him, al-Baydawi and al-Alusi and others, they in turn were doing that as well. They had this vast tradition in front of them. And they had, you can see from the works that they produced that while they were producing new works, they were building on this tradition that exists. And you can see the respect that they had for that existing tradition. So clearly, I think anyone who's going to be trusted with this sort of task has to be someone who can be trusted to understand the tradition and be faithful to that tradition, and then build on that tradition. And I think some of the projects that you're working on, that you've already mentioned, al-Itqan, now Tafsir al-Kabir of Imam al-Razi, and also the Tafsir of Ibn Juzay, and possible other projects. You alluded to some project dealing with the Tafsir of Ibn Ashur. All of that, inshallah, points to the importance of the Turath, that we have to build on that tradition, because we have a 1400-year tradition of great scholars who have written a tremendous deal about the Qur'an and the understanding of the Qur'an, and even the means of accessing the Qur'an, that we can't simply just throw all of that out the window, which brings us to some of the questions. This is a good segue into one of the questions. Khalid asked,
we've got quite a lot of questions. Should we take the questions on the hands first, direct ones? They want to ask directly.
Okay, sure.
Is that okay?
Okay, yeah, no problem. Rizwan wants to ask a question. Take this.
Yeah, thank you. So is it just one? Is it just one question to ask, or?
It's up to you, Rizwan.
Okay. One of my questions is in relation to the qualification of the translator of a high-level tafsir text like work like RAZI'S TAFSIR. Does it require that the translator or even an editor, if one is editing the Arabic text, does it require a breadth of knowledge of the traditional sort of sciences? And in the case of Razi, a knowledge of post-classical kalam, philosophy. So to justice to the translation or editing of the Arabic text, would it not require a wide range of learning for the translator to have a knowledge of the various sciences? That's one of my questions. The other question is in relation to volume 2. You mentioned it's more accessible, but is it to make it too accessible? Considering the high level discourse in this type of tafsir, and it's philosophical, theological. Is there a danger of dumbing down and losing accuracy in the actual translation when we're in the process of translating? And my last question is, what was the intended audience of Razi in terms of his tafsir? Thank you.
Okay, shall I go into answer those now? So yeah, I've in terms of the qualifications required, then I fully endorse that point, that it should be a wide range of studies, everything that is relevant. I mean, not necessarily post-classical kalam, because we're dealing with something earlier than that, but familiarity with terminologies, familiarity with the issues that are being raised is absolutely essential. First of all, to be able to read the text correctly. Even on the first page of Tafsir al-Razi, by the way, there's a typo, right? So in the list of things that he talks about some issues in which people can go astray. And among them, in the printed edition, you will see like this, وَالتَّعْدِيلِ وَالتَّجْوِيزِ. Now, that should be التعديل والتجوير, right? Because there's an issue of adl and jawr, and so it's ta'dil and tajweer. It shouldn't say ta'dil wa tajweez. Every copy of Tafsir al-Razi, including many of the manuscripts, say at-tajweez. And there's another typo where the word al-thawab is printed and it should say an-nubuwat. So the typos can be quite bad. So a familiarity with the terminology. And then in order to translate it usefully, you actually have to know about how these things are talked about in English as well, or whatever language. So you have to read some things in, whether it be kalam or whether it be fiqh and so on, to understand what are the terms that are used by translators. Now, in that, you might actually not like the terms that other translators have used, so you choose something else. That's okay if you've got a reason for doing so. But taking everything and translating it like very literally instead of understanding, for example, like I said, dawr. Dawr is used as infinite regression or infinite regress. So if I translated it as circularity, for example, I mean, circularity is sometimes what is intended as well. But the point is, there is sort of technical usages which you have to be familiar with. So as I said, a basic kind of way of telling if you're ready to translate a text is, would you be able to teach this text? Translation is its own skill as well. It's not just about knowing Arabic and knowing English. There's also something about knowing how to take things from one language to the other. And then the subject matter. I myself turned down translation projects that I was not confident to take on. Before I said yes to al-Itqan, I was offered to translate Ibn al-Jawzi's Muntazam in Islamic history. And I said I can't take it on because I'm not a history buff. I will misread place names as people. You know, I will just not understand the context of what I'm reading. It's not my field, so I will not take it on. So it was an easy no for me. So then when the Al-Itqan project came along, I was able to say, all right, this I can take on because I know what I'm doing. The second question about, okay, is there a danger of dumbing down? The danger might be there, but don't worry, inshallah, I won't dumb it down in volume 2. No, I'm sure that won't happen, inshallah. What was the audience for the tafsir originally? That's a really good question, and I don't have a very clear answer on that, because a lot of the work that I'm doing just now, which involves the manuscripts, I'm also investigating some questions about the background and authorship of this work and how it came to be edited and put together. It's a very big question that I'm working on as a distinct research project, but it has a bearing on a question of authorship, because it's come to be observed by a number of scholars that there are portions in this tafsir which were probably not authored by Imam al-Razi. So I mentioned that in the introduction. I mentioned the surahs, but there are potentially 3 groups of surahs which were inserted at a slightly later point and weren't written by Imam al-Razi. Whether that is actually the case or not is still an issue that I'm trying to get to a decisive judgment and decisive evidence about. And I've already found some very interesting evidence in the manuscripts, which inshallah I'm going to write up and publish as a paper. But with that sort of comes the question, what was he doing and how was it being delivered? And I understand that Imam al-Razi was actually teaching this in circles of knowledge, and there were people who were coming and writing it down, and then they went into different parts of the Islamic world with perhaps parts of his tafsir. So the audience of tafsir in general has always been a somewhat elite audience, a scholarly audience. There hasn't usually been a great emphasis on trying to make it accessible to the layman and laywomen. So that's not specific to the tafsir of al-Razi.
Next question. Over to you, Salman. You can read out the chats.
Sure. Okay, so we have a question from Khalid. He says, the first question, Maulana Abul Kalam Azad, rahimahullah, in his introduction to his tafsir in Urdu, he condemns, these are Khalid's words, he condemns Razi's approach to tafsir for damaging the real spirit of tafsir, i.e. diverting from the method of the Sahaba and the Tabi'een, and being influenced by Greek philosophy at the expense of Islamic sources. What is your view on this? Okay,
so I mean, I can say a view about it, but I just want to make it clear that I'm not al-Razi's lawyer. Actually, I sometimes describe myself that way on Twitter, but it's because I see people actually misquoting and misrepresenting him. I think I just want to understand him on his own terms and accurately present what he's saying. It's another question as to, is his manhaj the best manhaj? That's not why I translate al-Razi. I'm not muta'assib and partisan to him. But of course, I see a responsibility to redress some misunderstandings. So sure, I mean, if there's been in modern times a certain pushback against certain classical norms, especially deep involvement in philosophy, then the remarks of Abul Kalam Azad, as you've presented them, should be understood within that context, and he may have a point. To say that Imam al-Razi was diverting from the way of the Tabi'een and so on, I think that's unfair. What do we really know about the manhaj of the Tabi'een in tafsir? What we have are scattered narrations from them, where they would answer a question about particular words and phrases of the Qur'an. That's what we have of the tafsir of the Tabi'een. The fact that things would move on and develop is not surprising and not something evil. Imam al-Razi is sharing the views of the Tabi'een, no doubt, and expanding the scope of what is said and the type of questions that are asked around the verses of the Quran. And I think that's a valuable thing. In principle, that's a valuable thing.
Okay. His follow-up question, I'm just going to go ahead and read it, although it's not that relevant. If you want to comment on it briefly. What is your view on Farahi's approach to tafsir? I'm not sure.
Farahi's approach. Well, it's interesting because Farahi came to my mind when you said what you said about Abul Kalam Azad, because Farahi also has a thing where he goes after al-Razi. So actually it shows you the kind of importance of al-Razi. Why did they pick on him, right? Because they see him as emblematic of certain trends in tafsir, right? So al-Razi, and this is the part that actually does come up in this translation, and I give some references for further reading. But al-Razi he raises some issues with how do we even know what words mean? Isn't there a lot of doubt over how the meaning of words is transmitted and stuff like that? So what Farahi's point of view on al-Razi is that al-Razi overcomplicates things, and he essentially leaves you with so many different opinions about things that you start to think, does Allah's words even have a definite meaning, or are we condemned to wander in the fields of confusion and indeterminacy forever? So al-Farahi, again, coming in the modern era, so let's not neglect his context. He wants to say there is one meaning to every Quranic locution. Every ayah really has one meaning, and we can get to that meaning by a system and a process, which is his theory of nizam, or structural coherence. So that in itself is quite a bold, quite a novel statement to say that there's only one meaning. But I remember him saying about al-Razi that let's put aside the way of al-Razi, and let's have husn al-dhann again in the Quran, after people have had a kind of su'u dhann, or held a bad opinion about the Quran, which is to say they felt that you could never get to its true meaning. Let's have a positive opinion and believe that we can get to the right opinion. So apart from that, I don't want to say too much about my views on Farahi, but you can find them in some of my other talks actually.
Okay, so we have another question from Ahmed. He asks, was al-Razi's encyclopedic tafsir based on an intentional method, or is it just a spontaneous extended discussion of different topics?
Oh, al-Razi's tafsir is very systematic. So volume 1 has its own structure, which I talked about, the 3 kitabs, and it's unusual in that respect. After that, he follows a verse by verse format, sometimes a few verses at a time. And he breaks down his discussion usually in terms of masail, which are called inquiries. And those inquiries cover what has become generally the standard range of topics that are discussed. So you can find that in other tafsirs later on, like al-Qurtubi, for example, where it's broken down by inquiries. So one of them will be talking about what are the qira'at in this particular verse and what impact does that have on meaning, if any. You're going to find discussion of theological implications. You're going to find discussion of fiqhi implications. But for the most part, of course, his focus is on what is the meaning of the ayah. And that is the bulk of his tafsir. The bulk of it is really very recognizable as tafsir. And then there are some tangents where he goes on more length at something. But like, why are people so uncomfortable about tangents? I mean, tangents essentially are like an essay, like a bahth, or a piece of research which is presented. Like, for example, near the beginning of Surah Al-Kahf, then he's talking about the people of the cave and what happened with them. Then he's talking about wilaya, right? What is a wali of Allah? The karamat and the sort of supernatural events of divine care and providence that happen to some awliya. So he'll talk about that for some pages. Now we go, there's nothing to do with the meaning of the ayah. Well, it's context to the ayah, and if nothing else, it's a valuable discussion that we can benefit from.
Okay. Mansoor asks, we have a lot of scientific discoveries. I assume it means, in the modern age, there's been a lot of scientific discoveries and advancements. Do you feel Razi is the best in terms of rational approach? I'm sorry, Mansoor, your question is not entirely clear, but
okay, so is he the best to read nowadays in order to get a scientific approach? I mean, I think what I alluded to before was at least we can see how a much earlier thinker approached these questions, and therefore you get a sense of confidence of, you know what, maybe it's okay to ask certain types of questions about the Quran and to apply certain methods. So there is, there's this thing, there's been what they call it, i'jaz ilmi, or like scientific miracles in the Quran. And because that has been problematic in certain ways and strained and, implausible things, and which can ultimately backfire on the people who promote those ideas, there's also maybe been a bit too much pushback against the whole idea of reading the Quran with science in mind. I think that tafsir ilmi, which is to say scientific tafsir, scientific, applying scientific knowledge to your reading of the Quran is valid and actually inescapable, because we'll always be influenced by what we think about the world when you're reading verses which pertain to the world. A really nice example of what we can call tafsir ilmi is when al-Razi comes to the ayah about the setting. Dhul Qarnayn saw the sun, he found the sun setting in a murky pool, right? And that's sort of plain translation in Surah Al-Kahf. So al-Razi says, well, obviously the sun didn't set in the murky pool. Now him saying obviously it didn't is science, right? Because we rule out certain literal readings all the time. We all do it, and it's accepted in many, many places. You wouldn't always apply the most literal reading to everything, because common sense should prevail. So sometimes a scientific reality becomes so established that it is common sense as well. So it wasn't setting in the water, and after all, and then he talks at a little bit of length about the reasons why we know that actually the sun was it. Basically, I'm just trying to make sure which point he actually made. It wasn't the fact that it was the earth, the sun is not going round. It doesn't set on the earth, basically. That's the point that he eventually gets to, because he points to the fact that you can find that there are, if you time a solar eclipse happened at a certain time, and then you were to ask the people all the way to the east, when did that solar eclipse happen? And you ask them all the way to the west, when did that solar eclipse happen? They'll report it at different times of the day. So it tells you that the sun is not setting. I haven't done a great representation of his view, but inshallah you can read it when it comes. But the point being, he's using science to make the point about how this ayah should be understood and how it should not be understood. And that is something that we can continue to do, while, of course, recognizing that ultimately our scientific views can change.
Okay, Abdullah asks, who would you say is the modern scholarship, I think it's modern scholar, following the approach of Razi, which is very logical, rational? Or maybe put another way, are there certain scholars that you feel are continuing that legacy?
Well, that's an interesting question. I suppose, insofar as what he was doing was advancing, certain theological schools and points of view, then there are people who still belong to those schools. So there are still Shafi'i scholars, there are still Ash'ari scholars who are defending the positions of that school. I don't think it was, I don't want to see it as what he was doing and that was the core thing that he was doing, but to a large extent he was doing that, of course. And there are scholars who are still defending the Ash'ari view against various other approaches. But now it's become, Ash'aris versus Salafis, which was not the thing of his day. It was Ash'aris versus Mu'tazila. And to some extent, then he would also deal with certain literalism and anthropomorphism and so on, as it manifested in his time, as opposed to as well how some people want to attribute these labels to people in the current time, right? And sort of drag all those contentions into the current time. So yeah, there are people who are still engaged in those dialectics, as al-Razi was doing with the people of his day. He traveled widely you know, beyond the river, as we say, Wara al-Nahar, Transoxania, and he traveled around there, and he debated extensively with the Mu'tazila. Eventually, he was apparently poisoned by the Karramiyya. You know, he was really involved in debates. So sure, maybe people who are involved in debates, which is not my favorite pastime, they are following his manhaj in that respect. But in terms of tafsir, of course, in terms of modern works that follow a classical mold, not necessarily just a Razian mold, but of course the tafsir of Ibn Ashur is an important one because it is both a modern work. Ibn Ashur died just less than 50 years ago, but it is, it's using the tradition, it's built upon the traditional way of thinking it through, with some special emphasis of his own, but certainly makes extensive use and reference of Al-Imam al-Razi.
We have a question from Sheikh Riaz Ansari. I think the kind of questions that are asked in a tafsir are critical to its value. I haven't read a tafsir of the Qur'an that consistently asks questions as interesting as the questions Imam Razi explores. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Because really the question is, the way I look at tafsir and the way I talk about it in things that I write and do, it really is about answering questions. And before you can answer questions, you have to ask questions. Even the only place that you can find the word tafsir in the Qur'an, in Surah Al-Furqan, وَلَا يَأْتُونَكَ بِمَثَلٍ إِلَّا جِئْنَاكَ بِالْحَقِّ وَأَحْسَنَ تَفْسِيرًا. So they don't come to you with any example, but this can extend to like a contention, right? So the unbelievers coming with their contentions and their attempts to cast doubt, except that we bring to you the truth and the best tafsir. So tafsir, as it comes in this context, is the answer to a question, and that question could be, an objection and contention. It could be an innocent question. It could be a question that comes from the believers. It could come from the mind of the mufassir, him or herself. Tafsir is built upon istifsar, right, as some have said. So yeah, that's exactly it. The more a person asks the interesting questions, the more potential their tafsir has to be worth reading. So yeah, I really like that observation.
And this brings up a very interesting point. Sheikh Riaz's observation about Razi is really it's excellent, because I think maybe sometimes we get too caught up on, well, look at, he said this here and that's problematic because of this. I think sometimes the value in his work might be that, okay, maybe you're not satisfied with his answer, but it's sufficient that he asked an excellent question.
Yeah.
And so just him asking an excellent question, you might not agree with, even if you don't agree with his answer sometimes. The fact that he asked an excellent question, that he broached that question in the first place, that in of itself gives great value to the student of tafsir, that, this is actually a question concerning this verse, or concerning the Quran in general, or about the Sharia in general, that, it merits an answer, it merits further exploration, maybe beyond what Imam al-Razi has given. So, it then becomes an excellent sort of starting point for further exploration. And I think really people generally in scholarship, they don't understand, or many people don't appreciate that that half of excellent scholarship is asking the right questions. Because you can't answer them if you haven't asked.
Yeah, and I don't think that's always encouraged in every culture, is to ask questions. And you sometimes get seen as a troublemaker if you ask too many questions.
And I think to a certain extent, Imam al-Razi is seen by some, past and present, as a troublemaker for asking questions.
Yes, yeah. So there's that other famous jibe, isn't it? That he'll bring the doubt, he'll present the doubt, up front, and then he'll make delayed payment on the response.
Yes.
So because he's very good at building up the case of the opponent.
Yes.
And then sometimes he would just give a very brief.
His answer will be very brief.
Yeah, which I guess I understand people seeing it as a problem, but then you can sometimes find his answer elsewhere in the corpus. Maybe he's discussed it in another surah, or he's just saying, look, you know, someone's got to deal with this question, so someone else can do so.
Yeah, I mean, and I think maybe that's not something that is suitable for every reader, but I definitely think that asking questions, no matter how difficult those questions are, there definitely needs to be a place for it, at the very least in high levels of academic discourse. Because if scholars are not asking those questions, then, you know, who's going to ask those questions? Who's going to answer those questions?
Amazing, mashallah.
I think that basically brings us to an end of the questions. Unless somebody else has a question, I'd just like to sort of wrap up by asking you, you know, what does the future hold for Sheikh Sohaib, at least in the near future, in terms of your plans?
Well, we touched on some of those. So there's some immediate things to finish off. The Tafsir of al-Razi Volume 2 is actually overdue in terms of when I had intended to finish it, but you know, I have only a certain amount of regret about that, because the delay, you know, as they say, kullu ta'khira fihi khira, or something like that. Basically, there's some benefit that comes from the delay, because that delay has actually allowed these manuscripts to arrive at my door, and therefore what will come out of it will be much more authentic and higher quality than it would have been otherwise. I'll continue to work on that, inshallah. We've got the Tafsir of Ibn Juzay, which you know, I've reached with the students to sort of Tawbah now. And you know, what with all this stuff happening around the pandemic, sometimes progress has been a little bit stunted here and there. But inshallah, that also, you know, in about a year's time, we'll be ready for the final editing process to end up being released. And I think that will be a really useful contribution as well to the Tafsir library in English. And then, you know, there are other works that I'm developing, including my, you know, my thesis is being, I'm now turning it into a book for an academic audience, but at the same time, we will try to make it accessible and readable without dumbing down, inshallah.
Inshallah. Okay, Jazakallah khair. I was, as usual, it was a pleasure speaking to you and hearing your thoughts. And alhamdulillah, these discussions with you are always very beneficial. And I hope that, you know, we have opportunity to have many more of such discussions. Even though this wasn't something that I planned for on this platform, but alhamdulillah, it's always a pleasure whenever I get the opportunity to pick your mind.
For your gracious hosting, and to Mizan and Islamic courses for putting this together.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to Sheikh Salman and Dr. Sohaib. Fantastic as well. I think we went well over 1.5 hours. It's amazing. Amazing interview. Very good questions. Really looking forward to your next translations of the volumes. God bless you, inshallah. So, folks, if you want a copy of the recording, just leave your email address, if not already, on the chat. And inshallah, we hope to be hosting both Sheikh Salman and Dr. Saeed again, hopefully in the future when the next editions come out, and having a fruitful discussion. Otherwise, take care, everyone. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.